Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We have this afternoon two distinguished speakers with very different viewpoints. To your right, inappropriately, is Mr. Peter Tatchell, who actually has been best known in recent years as one of Britain and indeed Europe's leading campaigners on human rights. But he is also a lifelong socialist who has argued in favour of the planned socialist economy, certainly from the 1970s and 80s, and he is going to present that argument for a planned socialist economy this afternoon. To the other side, to your left, is Dr. Stephen Davis, who is the head of education at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which has been one of the leading right-wing free market research institutes in this country, and he is obviously going to argue in favour of the free market economy. Each speaker has agreed to limit the introduction to 7 to 8 minutes to put their case. When we have heard first from Mr. Tatchell and then from Dr. Davis, we then look to you to ask questions which will be put to both the speakers. It's a pleasure to ask Mr. Tatchell to propose the case for the planned socialist economy. Peter.
Thank you. The case for a socialist planned economy is overwhelming. The free market system is not working. It has led to huge inequalities of wealth, to a division of our society between the haves and the have-nots. So let me give you a few examples. In Britain today, the 1,000 richest people have a combined personal wealth of over £460 billion. £460 billion held by the richest 1,000 individuals in the UK. 1% of our population owns 70% of all private land. The top CEOs of our major companies earn at least 100 times more than their average employees. 100 times more than their ordinary employees, even though it's quite clear they do not contribute 100 times more in value. They may have value, but not 100 times worth more. Remember 2007 and 2008. The free market system brought this country close to economic collapse, with the banking crisis primarily affecting the Royal Bank of Scotland and Northern Rock. The light regulation allowed those banks to bring us very, very close to the collapse of our banking system and indeed our economy. So my argument is that we do need to change. We need a system of economy that is consistent with people's needs, not just the desire to make profit. So in other words, an economy based on need, not greed. An economy that serves all the people, not just the 1%. An economy which will ultimately, if we work together, be more productive and more efficient. So this is partly an argument about efficiency as well as an argument about equality. So what would the model of a socialist planned economy be? Well, certainly not the experiments in the Soviet Union and other communist-style states. Their models of highly centralized, bureaucratic, totalitarian economic systems were fundamentally flawed. They did not work, and they were often unjust. I think we should look to our own experience. Britain, not long ago, less than a century ago, had a sort of socialist planned economy. To meet the crisis of the Second World War and the battle against Nazism, Britain reorganized its economy on central government and socialist planning models. The whole economy was geared to winning the war effort and every aspect of the economy was subject to government scrutiny, regulation and control. Now, I'm actually not suggesting we go that far this time, but I can tell you this. In the Second World War, it worked. That model of putting the common good before private profit worked. It was a model which said, we face a crisis, we face a far bigger danger, and we have to work together to solve it. So therefore, those with the broadest shoulders, with the greatest wealth, have to make the greatest contribution. And they have to operate within a framework of what is truly in the national interest, not in the narrow interest of their particular class or family. So that model, to me, points to the fact that it could be done. And that was done without any suppression of civil liberties, without any mass expropriations. It was done in an efficient, effective way, which massively increased productivity. Even though we were resource poor, even though we had real big shortages, we managed to make what resources we had go much further when things were under central government oversight. As I said, I don't want to go that far in terms of the detail, but I think establishing a framework for the economy based on what is good for all of us is the model and way forward. So, for example, if we could have a social contract between the government, business and trade unions, I believe we would have a more efficient and productive economy. I think we'd have better industrial relations and fewer strikes. And that, to me, is the way forward. A tripartite coalition. Government, business and unions working together for the common good. We need a national investment bank. A national investment bank that can give government funding to ensure the things that need to be done to put the economy right and to make it more efficient. Now, in Norway, they had a sovereign wealth fund which was based upon profits from North Sea oil. And they have amassed a huge publicly owned investment portfolio which the Norwegian people benefit from. Here in Britain, during the oil boom of the 1970s and 80s, Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government squandered that huge oil bonanza. So we don't have a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have finances to fall back on now that the oil and soon the gas will be running out. The Norwegians show the way forward. They have a much better model, a model of government intervention, but in partnership and collaboration with business. So we all work together for the common good. I think also other ideas we need to look at are the ideas of economic democracy. We all expect political democracy, and indeed in the political system we all have one person, one vote. In the economic system, we are living under an economic dictatorship. The richest 1% control the economy. Everybody else has no power and shares only the crumbs of economic gain. I'd like to see worker and consumer directors on the boards of every company and every public institution, like the health service, to give direct input to employees at the top table. It's not only fair and right, but it will mean better productivity as well. Because if employees are up there at the top table, they're contributing their shop floor, frontline experience and knowledge, then companies and public services will operate better. I'd also like to see a requirement that when businesses increase their productivity, they have to give a share of their increased productivity to their employees. So the employees share in the success of a business. And that will produce better productivity and better industrial relations if employees feel they have a stake. I'd also like to see employee mutual societies to have control of their members' pension funds. So instead of hiving off pension funds to big corporate businesses who run them on corporate business lines, we would see employee-controlled pension funds which would operate on the basis of what was in the interest of the employees and their local communities. Now, those ideas are very simple. They are trialed and have been successfully applied in some countries. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't try it here. I think the move away from the free market to a system where there are proper regulations and controls. I mean, we already have some, businesses can't operate, even in this relatively free market system. Businesses can't operate just exactly as they please. They have to comply with health and safety regulations, equal opportunities, environmental protections, and so on. Adding some extra criterion, I think, would aid more responsible and more effective business operation. So for me, it's a win-win. It isn't that we're going to punish the rich and make them wander around in sackcloth and ashes. We're going to ask them to comply with fair shares for everyone, to ensure that everyone who contributes to the economy benefits, and that we as a country maximise our efficiency as well as our fairness. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Davis.
Thank you very much. Well, Peter Tatchell has just given you a critique of what you might call the last 20 years of, or 40 years maybe, of economic history, and he's put forward an alternative. I will argue that, first of all, we need to take a longer perspective to understand what is really at stake here. Secondly, that the alternative he suggests is not only a bad one, but that it's not necessary for some of the goals he advocates or seeks after, some of which I actually share. Now, first of all, he talks about how the last few years have led to a great growth in inequality. They have led to all kinds of, he says, bad outcomes. What you should remember is that the years since roughly the late 1980s have also seen on a global scale the biggest decline in absolute poverty in the whole of recorded human history. It's worth putting all of this into long-term perspective to give ourselves an idea, if you will, of just what a transformational effect the institutions of a market economy have had since they first really emerged at the end of the 18th century. In 1820, according to the World Bank's own estimates, 80% of the world's population lived on the then equivalent, in real terms, of $1.25 a day or less, which is their benchmark for absolute poverty. We now have a situation where, in fact, according to the World Bank's own most recent reports, less than 10% of the world's population is living at that standard of bare subsistence. And the greatest part of that decline has taken place, in the last 30 to 35 years. We have seen, as I said, an unimaginable decline in poverty. Nobody is saying that there is not much to do yet. In particular, we do have a serious challenge of getting people above the next level of the World Bank's markings. And in particular, we also have a problem of poverty in what you might call medium income countries. But there's no doubt that the direction of travel is very much the right one, and that the world we live in today is incredibly wealthy and vastly better off than the one inhabited by our ancestors for most of human history. And the people, the part of the world's population that have gained the most from this have been the poor, the people of below average incomes. It is true that we have certain people who are enormously wealthy, but I do not see wealth in itself, or inequality in itself, as being problematic. It's rather poverty that we should be worried about, and the best and most effective ways of dealing with that. Now, Peter put forward an alternative. He made a proposal to you for a different way of running our economic affairs. Now, I must say, I wouldn't actually describe what he advocated as socialism in the strict sense of the word, because he was careful to say that he was not advocating a completely state-owned planned economy of the Soviet kind, or even perhaps one like the one we had under the Attlee government or during the wartime coalition. But he did nevertheless use the example of the wartime coalition as an example, and the kind of controls that were put in place during that period of our history as something that we should seek to return to or to emulate. Several things to say about that. One is that a wartime economy is not an appropriate model. The crucial difference is that in a wartime period, there is one overriding goal which everybody in society shares and subscribes to, at least you hope so anyway, which is to win the conflict that the political entity, the state, the country is engaged in. As I'll explain in a moment, this is precisely not the situation that you have during a time of peace, and that is precisely why the kind of economy with a large element of state control that he's advocating is not appropriate. But also, I can't let it pass by saying that it is not an example of efficiency. Wartime economies are actually notorious, and the British economy during World War II is no exception for this, for misallocation of resources and waste. This is an inevitable feature of having a wartime economy, but it's not something that you want to reproduce in peacetime. Now, why is it not appropriate? Well, in a very real sense, a planned economy is theoretically impossible. None of us, nobody, no person, no organisation, no institution has the knowledge that is necessary to plan an entire economy. Even many of our large businesses are probably too big. One of the most striking features of very large firms is that the people at the top do not know what is going on in many parts of their organisation. And that's because they have expanded beyond the size that's appropriate for them. They're suffering from severe knowledge problems. It is not possible to know in advance what people will want, what kind of products need to be made, what kind of investments need to be made. And that's particularly true when, unlike in war, you have a multiplicity of goals and ends. When people want many, many different things, how do you reconcile all of those different competing and clashing ideas or desires and demands on resources, and do so in a way that is peaceful, democratic, and does not violate people's civil liberties or rights or individual independence? I submit that that is not possible to be done through the political process, and the greater the part played by the political process in allocating resources, the more difficult that will be. Now, Peter Tatchell says that in fact we're living under a dictatorship of the 1%. Actually, that's not true. Even the wealthiest person in the planet today, someone like the, in my view, entirely undeserving Carlos Slim, the second richest man in the world, got his wealth by corrupt political means, I would quickly add, he has minimal ability to influence a thing which is as big as the world economy. In fact, the reality of the economy now is that no one is in charge, and that is a good thing, because the nature of the world economic system is that nobody can be in charge if you want to have a society as large, as complex, as internally varied as the one that we have. And to think that somebody even as wealthy as, say, Warren Buffett or Carlos Slim or Bill Gates can have any effect on the world economy whose total output is measured in the tens of trillions of dollars, I think is a fantasy. Now, what he's advocating essentially is a move towards an economy which is a mixed economy, one in which there is a significant and extensive role for politics, you might say, and for the state political process. Now, when you what I would argue is that some of the goals he advocates or pursues, I actually share. But what I would say is there's no need to go down that route to do it, and that's not the most effective way of doing it anyway. Now, at the start of this, it was suggested to you that it was perhaps inappropriate that I was sat on your left rather than on your right. I would actually rebut that because I do not see myself in any sense as being an advocate or an apologist for the status quo. I am a defender of the principle that you should allow decentralized decision-making through free exchange of goods and services, and allow the prices that are generated by those exchanges to ultimately determine what is produced and where it is produced. There are very many features of the system we have at the moment, or the way things are going at the moment, which I do not see as being inevitably entailed or consequential upon that, and which I don't like. I do not like, for example, the monetary policy that the world's central banks have been following for really since the late 1980s, and with knobs on since 2008, which has basically been a massive policy of socialism for the rich for various reasons. That's one of the reasons why, in fact, certain people are doing so well right now. It's because we have a monetary policy which is almost guaranteed, and I believe almost designed, actually, to give them greater opportunities to increase their wealth, at least their paper wealth. It's also not inevitably the case that you have to have the kind of corporate structure that we have. I am not necessarily saying that we need to have a system in which a managerial class, which I think gives itself the pretensions of competence and capacity that it doesn't actually have, should arrogate to itself very high rewards and not take advantage of the knowledge of their children, of children, of their, for a slip of the tongue there, of their employees, indeed perhaps their children as well. Because I do actually think that many of our firms, as I said a moment ago, are now too large to be effectively managed by anybody, whether that be a political class or a class of private manager and public sector employees. So what I would say to you is this: even if you think that there is much about the world as it is now that you dislike, that should not lead you to support the alternative that Peter Tatchell has put forward to you. That's an alternative which, if it were to be tried, would, I believe, inevitably disappoint him and many others who support it. It would not deliver economic efficiency. It would inevitably, in my view, lead ultimately to political clashes over how to produce, what to produce and where to produce, because you simply cannot organise the productive and distributive processes of a complex modern society like ours using the process of political decision-making. You have to, in practice, use the decentralised decision-making process of the market economy. What form that takes can be very, very varied. You should not think that this necessarily means that you have to support the status quo. There are many different kinds of market economy, but that you should have a market economy is, I think, unavoidable if you want to keep the modern world in place. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we look to you, please, for questions. Can we have a first question?
Well, I'll pick on some of you who don't give a question.
Yes, thank you.
Considering at the moment the government are organising the NHS very well, how will we get to the point of being able to trust them to organise our detailed final?
Sorry, this is a question based on the government not organising the NHS very well.
Yeah, and so how would we expect them to organise the finer points of our economy if it were all organised?
I think that's initially to Mr. Tatchell. How, since they're not doing very well on the NHS, allegedly, could they organise the finer points of the economy?
Well, I think the starting point is that the NHS is top-heavy. There are too many managers, PR people and so on, not enough frontline staff. That's one point. The internal market within the NHS has added to cost, not diminished it, because you have to pay all these different people to monitor the internal market within the NHS. On top of that, the way the NHS is organised models private business. The people at the top make all the decisions, yet people down at the front line often have very important, valuable insights about how to make the NHS works better. So, for example, my local hospital, St Thomas's in London, they used to have a very inefficient appointment system. I complained to the staff. The staff said, we know it's inefficient, but we've got no voice on the board. They won't listen to us. So I would say that's why we need to have employee directors on the board of the National Health Service, and patient representatives as well, so that patients can have a voice on the boards of NHS management companies. And also, we all accept, or perhaps don't accept, the idea of bonuses for bankers. Why not bonuses for workers? And in the case of the NHS, why not give NHS staff a bonus if they can come up with a way of making the NHS work more efficiently? So based on their frontline experience, they may know a better way of organising the service, organising procurement of materials, medicines, equipment. And if they can come up with that idea and they can actually save the NHS money, then I think they should get a bonus. So those are just a few ideas.
Dr. Davis, do you agree with that diagnosis?
Actually, I do agree with some of it. What I'd say about the National Health Service is that the way it's both been set up originally and has evolved since the reforms of the 1980s is that it's an institution where you get the worst of both worlds. You've got both the worst of political control and government administration, and then the worst aspects, if you will, of large private businesses, as Peter says here. Now, it's worth looking back at the history of this, actually. When the National Health Service was being set up, there was an enormous row about it in the Cabinet, because some of the Cabinet ministers, notably a chap called Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, were of the mind that the government should fund healthcare, but not actually provide it. So Morrison and his supporters, people like Ernie Bevan, wanted to have the government fund healthcare, but have the hospitals, the actual delivery of healthcare, still be done by lots and lots of providers, private hospitals, local authority-owned hospitals, charitable hospitals, a whole range of institutions that already existed. Unfortunately, he lost that argument to Nye Bevan and Ellen Wilkinson, basically. And Nye Bevan's view was that you should have a system which was completely controlled by the Minister of Health in Whitehall, so that, as he put it, if a bedpan drops on the floor of a ward, it will echo around Whitehall. And what that means is you have, historically, an incredibly top-down and centralised system, which doesn't allow for discovery. It doesn't allow for people trying things out and finding out what works best. And it also leads to all kinds of serious inefficiency. Now, I actually agree with Peter Tatchell that the internal market is not a good thing. This is, as I say, a way to try and create an artificial market which doesn't work the way a proper market should, because you don't have freely established prices. And so you just end up, as he rightly says, with a whole extra layer of cost, an extra layer of bureaucracy. So we've actually ended up with something now which is the worst of both worlds. Could I just add that whenever people talk about this, the line that's commonly trotted out is that, well, you don't want to be like the United States, as though that's the only alternative. Well, actually, you know, no one in their right mind wants to have the American health system, which is problematic in all sorts of ways. There are, however, many, many systems on the continent, for example, in France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, which work much better than ours by a whole number of criteria, such as patient survival rate. And they typically have much more decentralisation and much more variety of both public and private input into them.
Mr. Tatchell, would you accept there's too much government control in the NHS?
Well, I think the government needs to set parameters and frameworks. So when it comes to the provision of drugs provided for by the NHS, I think the central government has to dictate a baseline, because otherwise, if it was all decentralised, if you lived in the northwest or the southwest or parts of London, your local provider may decide not to give you those drugs, even though medically you would need them. And it might do so for cost reasons or lots of different reasons. So I think we need a uniform system without the country, and we should not be dependent upon postcode lotteries.
Well, could I just respond to that quickly?
Yes.
That's a key point, actually, in the issue between myself and Peter. And that is, you need to make a trade-off between innovation and also, I would argue, efficiency on the one hand and uniformity on the other. It is true that if you have a more private or more decentralised system, this isn't just true about health, it's true generally, then you're going to have much greater variation, because you will have failures as well as successes, and you will also have variation between one part of the country and others due to fluctuations in demand and the cost of supplying various things. The point is that that also brings greater innovation. It's part of the discovery process. Now, you can argue that for certain, maybe you don't want that. Maybe you're prepared to take less efficiency and less innovation in order to make sure that everybody in the country has the same basic standard. That's a perfectly reasonable argument, it seems to me. And in certain areas like water supply, for example, I think it probably is correct. However, what you have to accept is that there's a cost to doing that. And the cost is basically less innovation and less discovery.
Can I just say that I think you are right, that there needs to be innovation and diversity and specialisms and so on, but I think that should be within the framework of the National Health Service.
Yes, well, that's difficult to do, though. That's the problem.
Okay, another angle, please. Have you got another question? Yes, please.
I'd like to ask Dr. Stephen that without government intervention,
Okay, a question to Dr. Davis, which is how, without government intervention, can you avoid the sort of problems in the economy that developed particularly in 2008, which you then outlined?
Okay. Before I say something specifically about the 2008 financial crisis, it's a very good question. And the big general question that's being put here is, isn't a free market economy prone to a cycle of boom and bust? In other words, doesn't it naturally have a cycle of frantic booms when everyone is very confident and lots of investment goes on, and then suddenly there's a massive collapse? Now, the honest answer is that a market economy will have a natural business cycle. This is undoubtedly true, because what will happen is that, as I said, when things are going well, lots and lots of people become very optimistic, and in particular, investors become optimistic. And people will start to engage in projects that are essentially a bit over-optimistic, and those projects suddenly turn out not to be viable. And at that point, you have a correction, and quite a lot of investments are written off, and a certain number of people lose their jobs for a while, and you have a bit of a downturn, and then the economy goes back. So a natural business cycle of that sort, in my view, is inevitable. However, and I think history supports this, if you have a truly free economy, that cycle is A, relatively mild, and B, it tends to be rapidly self-correcting. Now, you may say, what about 2008, or what about 1929, 1931, the Great Depression? My argument is that both of those major cycles were actually caused by government interference through central banks in the world's monetary system. And the problem with having a government which tries to even out those cycles is that essentially it's a bit like, to use an analogy, it's a bit like pushing all the wrinkles in a carpet out. What you end up with is one enormous wrinkle at the end of the carpet. What governments want to do all the time is to keep booms going. Politicians always want the economy to be growing, and so they typically use monetary policy and other government policy, but mainly monetary policy, to keep the economy growing at a rate that is ultimately not sustainable. And that's what was happening certainly before 2008. We had, from 2001 on, certainly, very, very low interest rates, mainly because of the Central Reserve and the Federal Reserve in the United States, but also the Bank of Japan. And the result was an enormous amount of misinvestment. Lots and lots of hot money was created by the banking system, which was then invested in investments that were not profitable. And had the rate of interest been at the correct level, they would have known it was not going to be profitable. The trouble is, you can't keep this going forever. And, you know, as a very famous economist once said, if something can't go on forever, then it won't. And what happens then is that all of that excessive investment has to be written off. Now, the question is, what do you do when there's the bust? Now, my own view, personally, is that what we should have done in 2008 is done what Iceland did and allowed the insolvent banks to go bust. And in particular, we should not have bailed out the bondholders in banks. There would have been 18 months of really severe economic pain, admittedly, but we would then have recovered, as indeed Iceland has done. Something similar should have happened in 1929-31. Instead, what happened was that the Federal Reserve of the United States reduced the world's money supply massively by about 1/3 in 2 years, and that had the result of severely shrinking the entire world economy and destabilizing the whole world trade system, which was in admittedly bad shape anyway. So I think you have to just bite the bullet and say, if you have a market economy, you're going to have a business cycle. But if you try to iron out that business cycle through government intervention, what you're actually going to do is to make the big ups and the big downs less frequent and more longer lasting and more severe.
Mr. Tatchell.
Going back to 2008, I think part of the problem was that the government at the time, which happened to be a Labour government, did adopt a light touch in terms of financial regulation, actually reduced some of the controls and safeguards that had been in place on banks. And that was taken advantage of by some of the top directors in RBS and Northern Rock to try and make a fast buck. They were allowed to reduce their capital to capital ratios in stocks, which of course left them very vulnerable when things went bottom up. I would have said that in order to avoid a repeat of 2008, we need to ensure that there is proper regulation in place, but also introduce a new criminal offence. I would make it a criminal offence for directors and CEOs to act in ways that were financially negligent, reckless, or irresponsible. Now, I agree you can have a debate about how you interpret those words, but you can bet that if the directors of Northern Rock and RBS had known that there was a law which said that they could be personally held liable through the seizure of their own assets and imprisonment if they took reckless, irresponsible decisions, they would not have made those choices that led to the crash of 2008. So I think that, to me, is not a guarantee and not the only solution, but I think it is in the right direction and would reduce the chances of a repetition in the future.
Can I just very quickly respond to that? The thing is, first of all, it's a complete myth that there was no regulation or light regulation of the financial services sector.
Well, lighter.
Well,
a bit lighter.
What you had was an enormous stack of regulations. Now, what you can say is they were the wrong regulations, possibly. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the real villains in this case are not so much Fred Goodwin and other chancellors like him in the financial services industry. It's Alan Greenspan and the guys at the central banks who were basically doing two things. One was they were turning on the money supply pump, so there was enormous quantities of hot money being created by the banking system because of the loose monetary policy and the low interest rate policy of the central banks. But the other was that they let it be believed, quite correctly in the event as it turned out, that no matter what the banks did, they would be bailed out. Now, that was the fundamental error, it seems to me, because just think about this. Suppose you are playing poker and you know that no matter what you bet, somebody not playing is going to make up all your losses. What are you going to do? You're going to bet completely irrationally, and you will bet the entire mortgage on a pair of twos, or something like that, or even a high card. That essentially is what happened in the financial markets. The bankers believed, and as it turned out quite correctly believed, that no matter what they did, they were going to be bailed out by the central banks. And that's what led to the kind of reckless behaviour that was mentioned. Now, I don't think you need a criminal offence. I think there's a much more straightforward way of altering this. One is to withdraw that guarantee, but the other is to say that certain banks trading in certain kinds of activity, high-risk activities in particular, should be organised not as limited companies, but as in fact they normally were until the 1980s and 1990s, as partnerships. Because what that means is that you are liable in your personal assets for the debts that the organisation you're a partner in run up. That's how Lloyd's works, for example. That concentrates the mind remarkably, because you know that not only will you lose your invested capital, but you'll actually lose your house and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So I don't think you need to have a whole lot of regulations, much less a new criminal offence. You simply have to have a straightforward statutory framework, to use Beattie's expression, which is that banks engaged in certain kinds of trade should not be organised as limited liability corporations. They should only be allowed to be organised as partnerships with the people then bearing the burden of the risk as well as the rewards.
I think there's time for one more short question and answers. Yes.
To what extent is government failure inevitable when governments intervene in markets?
To what extent is government failure inevitable when it intervenes in markets? Dr. Davis, that's for you.
I think that it is. Now, let me just say that. Okay, I'll explain why I think government failure is inevitable, what I mean by that. If governments intervene in markets, it is almost always the case that those interventions do not achieve the ends that they set out to achieve. The reason for this is basically the one I outlined. It's the knowledge problem. It's the fact that political actors do not have the knowledge to know what the consequences of their actions will be or what they most need to do in order to achieve the ends that they want. And that's true even in the apparently simple case of knowing how to fight a war, for example, which you heard about earlier. Now, what I do want to say is there is plenty of private failure as well. Lots and lots of people make private undertakings and they don't work out because private individuals also lack the knowledge. However, they do have prices which they can use as signals as to what they ought to do. Plus, and this is the crucial point, however, when private actors, investors, companies or individuals make mistakes, the consequences are relatively limited. When governments make mistakes, when government action and intervention fails and has bad results, the consequences are often very large scale and much more dramatic. I mean, for example, just recently, we've discovered that the advice that governments have been giving and enacting in policy to have diesel engine cars for the last 30 years has been completely wrong-headed and has had disastrous results. And that's because when governments make laws or pass regulations that encourage the use of diesel-fueled cars and vehicles, it has an effect across the entire economy. So it isn't so much government failure, it's knowledge problems more generally, which happen to be particularly acute where governments are involved.
Mr. Tatchell.
Going back to the issue of 2008, I think if the government had not intervened, then millions of people would have lost their life savings, and the personal consequences for those individuals and their communities would have been absolutely devastating. So therefore I think it was right, I can see your argument, but I think ultimately it was right the government stepped in to bail out the banks in that instance. Although you might say that a better one would have been just to give the money, let the banks go to the wall, but give the money to the people.
I would tend to support that, actually. I think what should have been done for moral reasons, actually, reasons of reasonable expectations, would be to bail out the depositors, but I would not have bailed out the bond holders. And the main point, if you look at what happened to the banks, the shareholders have taken an enormous hit. The depositors were protected by the government, and I do agree with Peter, that actually was the right thing to do. But the people who've also been bailed out, who should not have been bailed out, were the bondholders. And I do not see why government should see it as being part of their role to protect wealthy people from the consequences of mistaken investment decisions, which is what happened. And that's not part of a properly running market economy, in my view.
And the second point was, as we are trying to shift towards renewable energy to combat climate chaos and destruction, I think government leadership has been very important and significant. Now you can say it isn't as well done as it could have been, but I think without the government giving a lead and giving incentives and giving tax breaks and so on, I don't think we would have made the significant shift towards greater renewable energy that we've done. And as you probably heard just a couple of weeks ago, for the first time in Britain since the 19th century, coal was not used to generate our power in this country. That is a good thing. That's progress in the right direction, and a lot of it has been as a result of government investment and incentives in renewable energy.
Thank you. And I think 1 minute for each speaker, just to summarise or reply to any points they've not been able to respond to.
Okay. I would basically say the following thing to you. We live in a world which is vastly wealthier than those that our ancestors lived in. This is because, over the last 200 years, we have discovered how to use voluntary exchange to coordinate economic activity that otherwise would not take place. And that has made the world much richer. To try and replace this with a more extended role for the political decision-making process would, I believe, be disastrous.
Thank you. Mr. Tatchell.
I accept that there has been a huge growth in national and global wealth over the centuries. We are quite clearly at a much higher standard of living than we were decades or centuries ago. It's true that global poverty has gone way down. That's fantastic. But the question is, might it have gone down faster, and might fewer people still be in poverty if we had a different economic model? If we had a model of the economy based upon need rather than profit, based upon the common good rather than the privileged wealth of a handful.
Thank you. And just to ask for a vote, I'm sure people came with not completely open minds and had a view, but let's see what the view is at the moment. If you would believe more in the planned socialist economy, could you indicate planned socialist economy? Raise your hands, please.
Yeah, go on, confident.
Yes, we do have a number. Yes, thank you, and at the back. And please raise your hands if you believe more in the free market economy. Could you raise your hands if you do believe substantially
Anybody
in
who's-
the free market economy?
Anyone who's not put their hand up?
Yes,
So
we-
what do you believe in then?
Right. Okay, put your hands down. I think it's fairly clear. More for the free market economy. Those who abstained, please, put up your hands. Who didn't? There were some abstainers. Hands up if you didn't vote. Okay. Well, I think given the venue of this school, it's not surprising, probably, there is a marked majority in favour of the free market economy. But lastly, our speakers are expert, have taken the trouble to come here and have, I think, given excellent, very clear expositions and have both been prepared to debate very strongly with each other and reply. So I think we should show our appreciation of two excellent presentations. Thank you, and we are exactly at the end of afternoon school, so it is time. Very clear. Impressive. I should have